They were buried with golden headdresses and spears, not in temples, not in palaces, but scattered across the frozen steppes of Central Asia. A civilization so powerful, so fearless, that they became the very legend the Greeks used to scare their children at night. The Scythian Amazons. For 2,000 years, the world believed they were myths, invented, fantasy. But in 1970, archaeologists made a discovery that shattered everything. They were real. And what makes it even more shocking? Over 300 of their graves have been found since then, each one telling a story of female warriors who didn't just fight alongside men. They rewrote the rules of warfare itself. So how did a society of nomadic horse archers become so powerful that their female warriors could challenge empires? And why did history spend 2,000 years trying to erase them? Before we understand the Amazons, we need to understand the board they played on. Between the 8th century before Christ and the 5th century after, a vast territory stretched from the Black Sea in the west all the way to Mongolia in the east. The Greeks called it Scythia, but it wasn't a kingdom, it wasn't an empire. It was something far more dangerous. A patchwork of nomadic tribes united not by borders, but by horses, by bows, and by a culture that had never known the walls of a city. The geography here was everything. There were no fortresses, no stone cities, no farms locked in place. Just endless grasslands, forest steppe in the north, desert steppe in the south, and plains so vast that an army could vanish into them like sand into water. A warrior here wasn't bound by borders or supply lines. A warrior was the supply line. And the Scythians understood this better than anyone. But here's what made them truly dangerous. They controlled something every empire in the ancient world needed: gold, mountains of it. Their gold work was so legendary that centuries later, when archaeologists opened their kurgans, those massive burial mounds, they found wealth that made kings' treasuries look like children's piggy banks. Jewelry, armor, decorative plaques so intricate they tell us more about Scythian society than any written text ever could. But they weren't just traders. They were surrounded by empires hungry for dominance. The Persians to the south, the Greeks to the southwest, the Medes, the Egyptians. To survive, the Scythians had to be not just warriors, they had to be masters of the steppe itself. Now here's where it gets revolutionary. The Greeks fought with infantry, phalanxes, heavily armored men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, moving like a wall of bronze. It was dominating on flat ground. But on the steppe? On the steppe, it was a funeral march. The Scythians discovered something simple but devastating. The horse and the bow were the great equalizers. A rider on horseback with a composite bow could strike from distances no infantryman could reach. They could retreat. They could flank. They could disappear and reappear like ghosts. But here's the innovation that changed everything, and this is where the Amazons enter the equation. The Scythians realized something their neighbors didn't. If a woman could ride a horse as well as a man, if she could draw a bow with the same strength, if she could endure the same hardships on the open steppe, then she was just as deadly. And the archaeology proves this wasn't metaphorical. Female warriors aged 10 to 45 were buried with the same weapons, the same armor, the same honor as their male counterparts. But this wasn't some experiment. This was necessity becoming culture. When the men were away on long hunts or raids, hunts that could last weeks, the women weren't sitting in camps waiting. They were defending the herds. They were protecting the pastures. They were hunting. And when enemies came, they fought. Children grew up watching their mothers as warriors. Girls learned to ride before they could walk properly. Archery wasn't a sport, it was survival. This wasn't a separate Amazon army. This was an integrated military force where roughly 20 to 25% of combat burials belonged to women. But the real turning point came when this military advantage translated into something even more powerful: political authority. Around the 5th century BC, a woman named Tomyris, a Scythian queen, didn't just lead a tribe. She defeated Cyrus the Great himself. Cyrus the Great, the man who had conquered the Persian Empire, the man who was considered invincible. History remembers Cyrus as a genius, but it barely whispers Tomyris's name. Yet she beat him in open battle, using the very tactics we're describing. Hit and fade, exhaust the enemy, let the steppe become their graveyard. Centuries later, when the Roman general Pompey celebrated a triumph over Mithridates VI, the Roman historian Appian recorded something remarkable. Among the kings and generals paraded in chains, there were female rulers of Scythia, plural, contemporary. This wasn't legend, this was geopolitical reality. The Scythians had cracked a code. They understood that on the steppe, gender wasn't a limitation. It was irrelevant. Power came from skill, endurance, and the ability to survive in a landscape that killed the weak, regardless of their sex. And this changed how they waged war. Their military was unpredictable. Their leadership could come from anywhere. Their enemies never knew if they'd face a man or a woman across a battlefield. And frankly, it didn't matter. Both were equally lethal. But empires don't last forever. And the Scythian system, for all its innovation, had a fatal weakness. It depended on something that couldn't be manufactured or stored. It depended on a specific way of life, a specific geography, a specific set of values. Between the 5th and 7th centuries AD, things began to shift. The world was changing. Empires were consolidating. More importantly, Islam was expanding eastward. And with it came new social systems that didn't prize the warrior culture, that restricted women's autonomy, that replaced the open steppe with organized states. The Scythian way of life wasn't destroyed in a single battle. It wasn't conquered by a single enemy. It was slowly, methodically replaced. Like an ecosystem invaded by a new species, the Scythian nomads either adapted, fled, or disappeared into the peoples around them. Within a few centuries, the name Scythian vanished from maps. But something remarkable happened. Their legacy didn't die. It transformed. The peoples who succeeded them, the Sarmatians, the Khazars, the Mongols, they inherited the Scythian playbook. And remarkably, they carried forward something the Scythians had proven: that women could be warriors, that they could lead, that they could shape empires. When Genghis Khan rode across Asia 4 centuries later, there were strong women among his steppe nomads. Queens, generals, shamans who wielded as much power as any Khan. This wasn't accidental. This was cultural memory. And today, even after 1,500 years, traces remain. In Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, scholars have found cultural relics of egalitarianism, remnants of a world where women and men were equal partners in survival and power. But here's the truly haunting part. The Greeks, who wrote most of the histories we inherited, couldn't even accept what they saw. They turned these real women into myths, into Amazons, man-hating, breast-removing fantasies who barely qualified as human in their minds. They couldn't conceive of a world where women were simply equal. It took 2,000 years in archaeology to prove what the Greeks refused to believe: that a woman's value wasn't determined by beauty or submission, but by skill, courage, and the ability to survive a landscape that had no mercy for the weak. So what does the Scythian Amazon story tell us about our own world? We live in an age obsessed with finding proof that women are equal to men. We debate, we argue, we demand evidence. But the Scythians were something different. They weren't equal because they fought for equality. They were equal because survival demanded it. Because the steppe didn't care about your gender, only your skill. And there's a lesson in that. Power isn't inherited through tradition or ideology. Power is earned through competence. And every system, whether ancient or modern, that ignores competence in favor of convention will eventually be challenged by reality. The Scythian Amazons didn't disappear because they lost a war. They disappeared because the world changed. Because new empires rose that had different rules. But for nearly 1,000 years they proved something simple. When you remove the artificial barriers, when you let people compete on merit alone, you don't get weakness. You get a civilization that frightens empires. The Greeks wanted to remember the Amazons as a curiosity. History wanted to forget them entirely. But archaeology refused to let them disappear. So here's my question for you. If a nomadic culture 2,000 years ago figured out how to harness the full potential of their population, regardless of gender, what does that say about us? About the talents we're still ignoring? About the barriers we're still accepting? Drop a comment below. Tell me, what ancient innovation do you think we've forgotten that could solve a modern problem? And if you want to explore more hidden histories that redefine what we think we know, hit subscribe. Because the past is full of lessons. We just have to be brave enough to listen.